Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Faye. Aid needs to be accountable, but is the aid community really meeting the needs and wishes of the people it serves? In this session, we're going to focus on the 2022 Humanitarian Accountability Report. We'll hear that the aid community is falling short and that it needs to reset to make accountability non-negotiable. As Faye said, hundreds of you are joining us today, and we're really, really delighted about that. And we would ask you to share the findings of the report with your networks and take action. We're going to be hearing from experts from the CHS Alliance, donors, senior representatives of the UN and other international organizations, as well as NGOs on the ground. And as you heard, please do use the chat to ask questions and of course tweet, hashtag HAR 2022, Twitter handle CHS Alliance. But first, let's find out about that report and the key findings. And I'm delighted to give the floor first to Tanya Wood, Executive Director of the CHS Alliance, followed by Obanda Ekesa, co-author of the report. Tanya, over to you.
Claire, thank you so much, and let me welcome everyone to this event. I'm hugely delighted to speak to you all as the Executive Director of the CHS Alliance. CHS Alliance is a global movement. The members are really passionate about demanding that aid organisations are more accountable to the people that we serve. Our members also believe that we have to do far more to reduce barriers that mean the people in crisis don't become further marginalised in exercising their agency, influence and power over their own lives. As an alliance, we want to strengthen accountability throughout the aid system so that people affected by crisis are at the heart of assistance. The means that we do this is through the commitments that we've made as a sector to the people in crisis, the Core Humanitarian Standard, or CHS. Next slide, please. As this audience, you know that bringing about system change is complex. And to do so requires a much greater understanding of where we're making progress and as well the barriers that are preventing this. So released today, the 2022 Humanitarian Accountability Report builds on the findings of other system-wide calls for transformation of the aid system, including ALNAP's recently released State of the Humanitarian System, and as well studies from Ground Truth Solutions. Importantly though, the Humanitarian Accountability Report really relies on the data of many of our member organisations and organisations who've taken the efforts to verify their findings. They've worked really hard in measuring and making improvements against the CHS commitments across the globe from many challenging contexts, and be able to use this data to see where those opportunities are, as well as where the barriers still exist. The report, though, does also recognise the complexity of the power dynamics that we're trying to shift. And for that reason, it includes a number of really fascinating dialogues that are based on different perspectives of how we can make progress. These are definitely worth a read, and I want to give my huge appreciation to all those who contributed. Let me though now pass over to Obando, one of the authors of the report, who will talk us through the report's findings. Thanks to you, Obando.
Thank you, Tanya. My name is Obando Ekesa, as you've heard, a co-author, together with Dr. Glenn O'Neill and Lois Austin of OLRI, Research and Evaluation Consultancy. But before I present the report findings, I'd like us to watch a brief 2 minutes and 30 seconds animation, which highlights the key findings and the recommendations from the report. Then I'll briefly talk about 3 key findings.
The Humanitarian Accountability Report 2022. Accountability is non-negotiable. The way people and communities facing crisis experience receiving assistance is the most important measure of how well aid organizations are doing their jobs. People affected by crisis must be able to hold humanitarian organizations to account for their actions. Are aid organizations meeting the core commitments they have made to the people they serve? 7 years of data from almost 100 organizations measured against the core humanitarian standard on quality and accountability show we have a long way to go to meet the 9 commitments made to people in crisis. Data from organizations who use the CHS show we need to do much more to engage with, listen to, and learn from people affected by crisis, the people we serve, the reason aid organizations exist. When aid organizations meet the CHS commitments, they protect people from sexual exploitation, abuse or harassment, support local leadership, include everyone, respond to the climate emergency. We do see tangible progress when aid organizations dedicate time, energy and resources to making the needed improvements to meet the CHS. They better deliver on 7 out of 9 commitments. Now we know dedicated and focused action by organizations who measure and monitor over time against the CHS commitments, improve their work, and are more accountable to people affected by crisis. CHS Alliance advocates for change through an accountability manifesto. Number 1, the views of crisis-affected people must direct all work. Number 2, aid leaders must drive a whole-of-organization approach to accountability. Number 3, local leadership must be supported to accelerate accountability. Number 4, everyone across the aid system must work together for a collective approach to accountability. To learn more, visit chsalliance.org/HAR 2022.
Thank you. I'll now dig more to the report through 3 key findings, as I mentioned. Firstly, we found that overall, the aid system is falling short when it comes to meeting its core commitments to people affected by crisis. When we look at the aggregated data on this graph from the report, we see that the organizations are not fully meeting a single commitment of the CHS. This isn't looking at any one single organization, but when we look at all the data, system-wide studies, and hear from the thought leaders, it is clear. The principle of accountability as non-negotiable is just not the current reality for people facing crisis today. As we can see at the bottom of this graph, the lowest scoring CHS commitment is all about welcoming and addressing complaints, essentially facing up to when things go wrong and changing how we work in response, rather than continuing with business as usual. This is a stark and sobering finding. As we move on to the next key finding, we see a repeated pattern on where organizations perform better and worse in terms of accountability. The aid system seems to be better at policies than people. Generally, organizations are better at having good policies and internal processes, as well as coordinating with other similar organizations. However, organizations struggle with listening to and learning from people affected by crisis and adapting based on what they hear. This way of working risks already vulnerable people being ignored, exploited, or abused. Now, turning on to the third key finding of the report, there is hope. This graph shows that organizations can improve their accountability. Long-term verified organizations who monitor and measure their work repeatedly against the CHS over a number of years are showing clear signs of progress in how they work with people affected by crisis. As we can see here on the graph from the report, we see the most progress over time in the areas that the aid system is struggling most with, that is CHS commitments 4 and 5 on communicating, encouraging participation, feedback, and complaints. It shows that the CHS verification is helping aid organizations to change how they relate to people affected by crisis. This means that these organizations are now more likely to co-create strategy and programming with people who know best, and they are more likely to find out what's not going right early on so that they can stop serious problems starting. Promisingly, the report finds that the organizations using the CHS are making progress against one of the biggest failings that shames the aid system, that is sexual exploitation and abuse of vulnerable people by aid workers. As we hear in the report, CHS verification prompted a Syrian NGO, Takaful al-Sham, to proactively make sure the people they support know how their staff should behave, especially what is unacceptable behavior on sexual exploitation or abuse, and what to do if these expectations were not met. As a result of these changes, Takaful al-Sham saw a big increase in how many people knew how to complain if something wasn't right. And this was up from around 60% to 90% of program participants that they asked. Ending on that inspiring example of the progress that is possible, I'll hand over to Tanya to wrap up. Thank you.
Many thanks, Obando, and as well as Glenn and Lois for the work that's gone into this. Based on these three key findings that you've outlined for us, the report pushes us further with a call to action, what we're calling the Accountability Manifesto, how we can unite to create system change and make the aid system more accountable to people affected by crisis. This manifesto calls for collective action and increased political will for accountability. The four calls are that, of course, crisis-affected people need to direct our work. Accountability is an approach, it's not an activity. And if we don't take this more seriously and adjust our way of working, we jeopardize the work that we do on behalf of these people. We need strong and vocal leaders. Leaders have a huge responsibility and they need to drive a whole of organizational approach to accountability to affected people. There needs to be far more recognition of how local and national leadership accelerates accountability to push the shifts of power to take the decision-making closer to the people themselves. And finally, a collaborative and collective approach is needed if we really want to be able to shift the system to be more accountable and make this a real non-negotiable. We cannot have a siloed approach and we need to work much better together. I imagine and hope this resonates with all of you joining us today, but we do need to do more. Please do read the report that's now live on the CHS Alliance website. Consider the calls to action and think about what actions you and your organisation can take. Thank you again. Thank you for being here with us. I'm going to now hand back to Claire so we can start hearing the reactions to the report from the people living and working across the aid system. Thanks, Claire.
Thank you very, very much, Tanya. And as we heard, that the aid sector is not fully meeting any of its accountability commitments, especially those on listening to people affected by conflict. So for our first session, we are going to go to South Sudan, and we're going to hear from two people who have received aid and given aid. Gloria Sommer is the Executive Director of the Together in Transformational Initiatives Foundation that promotes progress, peace and prosperity in the country. country. And Sara Beslaunianti is the UN Humanitarian Coordinator for South Sudan. We had very much hoped that Gloria would be able to join us, but any of you who've been to South Sudan will know that in some parts of that country, it's difficult to get internet connectivity, but we have a plan B. So we are now going to play a video of Gloria, and her words may be familiar to some of you if you've read the foreword of the report, which was written by Gloria. She is now going to read out the foreword of the report in this video.
I know what it's like to not be listened to. It's not until you have been ignored at the very time you most need help and support that you understand how it feels. The feeling is the same if you're ignored by a person, an organization, or a system which has more power than you. That's why I wholeheartedly welcome this report. The Humanitarian Accountability Report gives us a much needed, honest look into how well the aid system is listening and hearing the people who are experiencing the worst the world has to offer. The report helps us to face up to what happens when things go wrong. It also proposes actions that can be taken today to protect the rights and dignity of people in the most vulnerable situations. As a 1990s Sudanese child of the Uganda refugee camps, I grew up in places with some of the highest mortality rates in the world at the time. Growing up, we were repeatedly attacked and displaced by rebels of the Lord's Resistance Army, yet unable to go home. We faced looting, violence, and many children were abducted. All in all, more than 100,000 people were killed and tens of thousands of children conscripted during those dark days. The sanctuary of the refugee camps and the kindness of many meant that I received shelter and help to survive. Yet, time after time, my family's needs were not listened to and we felt ignored by all sides. People planned what they gave us without asking our needs. I understand they were doing what they could to deliver what they thought we needed. But when you have no choice, you feel powerless. Sometimes the system felt unfair to my family with inflexible criteria. Hidden vulnerabilities and invisible needs were just not recognized. This wasn't the last time I was confronted with the harsh realities of war. In July 2016, the fighting in my hometown of Juba reached my family home. Hundreds of women and children needed shelter and protection with nowhere else to go. So I opened up my family compounds to help. Moved by the experiences I had of rape, murder, abduction, and forced displacement, I set up a new NGO led by women, for women and their children. Now I strive to lead an organization where we give space to everyone to make decisions on how they want to be assisted, just as I would have wished when I faced displacement, uncertainty, violence, and loss. Listening to the people we help just makes sense to me. Every day I see this approach bringing about change and providing a better response. Together with those we serve, so much innovation is brought to the table by people that others have looked down on, underestimated or marginalized. To me, this shows the importance of the aid system having a core standard that puts the dignity of affected people at the heart of response. Ultimately, to me, this is what accountability really is. Everyone, no matter their status, being able to speak truth to power and hold those with authority to account for their actions. Thank you.
Much, Gloria. As we heard, she wasn't listened to when she was a refugee in the Ugandan refugee camps. Now she set up her own foundation to ensure that people are listened to. Sara Beslaunianti, you are the UN Humanitarian Coordinator in South Sudan. First of all, let me ask you for your response to what Gloria was saying to us.
Thank you, Claire. And listening to Gloria, everything she said resonated so loudly with me. Just hearing her reflections about her own experience as someone who needed aid, but then also someone who gave people shelter who were also in desperate need. Listening to her, for me, is a reflection of a story I know all too well. And it just reminds us of that imperative, the humanitarian imperative, but not just the humanitarian imperative, but the humanitarian imperative with accountability, which is critical. And it is non-negotiable. And my reflection listening to her was, we have to continue to do better. We have to do more, and we have to do better. We must, because humanity is depending on us.
Sarah, one of the areas where you have to do better, as Obanda mentioned, is in preventing sexual abuse, exploitation, harassment. We know that there were media reports last week that in a UN refugee camp in Malakal in South Sudan, there were allegations against aid workers of abuse. It would seem, though, that there's a lot of talk about prevention, but it doesn't seem to be working. So what needs to be done to really to deliver on that protection that's needed for these very vulnerable people? Let me see whether Sarah is able to join us for that question. Sarah, did you hear my question?
I don't know if you can hear me very well.
Yes, I can.
Because it came in very broken.
Did you hear my question?
But I think I heard the question around sexual exploitation and abuse. And I'm going to speak to it in general because I didn't get the question.
It was about the reports last week in the UN refugee camp.
Just to say to you, the reports...
Let's see whether we can hear something from Sarah, because obviously
I think we're speaking over each other. So I'm going to try and answer you again. So the report on sexual exploitation and abuse. Can I go ahead, Tanya?
Yes, of course you can go ahead. We're waiting for you. Please go ahead. Sarah, the floor is yours. Let's see if we can hear from Sarah. I know we all want to hear what is being done in general and also perhaps in Malakal. Sarah, let me ask you once more whether you can give us your view on what needs to be done to prevent sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment. Can you hear us? In this case, I am very, very sorry.
Can I ask you to put the question in the chat so I can answer, because I didn't hear the question. But let me just speak to PSEA, and I'm sure.
Yes. Please.
I hope you can hear me. I'm going to try to speak again because we have network issues, it seems. But this is really important, so I want to make sure that you hear me. The allegation of sexual exploitation and abuse that came in the Al Jazeera story is about a protection of civilian sites in Malakal, where there were reports of sexual exploitation and abuse back in between 2013 and 2018 to 2019 or so. And those cases that were reported in the media, Al Jazeera, are not hidden cases. They're not cases that were being covered up or concealed. They were cases that have been investigated. Very importantly is the fact that no one who's vulnerable, nobody who's disenfranchised, nobody who's in need of support should in any way be victimized. Nobody who's seeking aid should be made to feel that they are subjected to any power dynamics. No one should have to go through that. No woman, no girl, no boy, no man should be subjected to any form of abuse, to any form of intimidation, to any form of a disadvantage at all. And this is something that we as a humanitarian community in South Sudan are ensuring. I hope you can still hear me because I'm freezing on this end. Are ensuring that we continue to take action on, we continue to strengthen our mechanisms to ensure that we listen and we learn. We hear and we're committed to welcoming and addressing complaints. Please send your complaints in if you're in South Sudan. Contact me directly if you're in South Sudan. And I am committed as humanitarian coordinator to make sure that we listen and we learn. And the entire humanitarian community is committed to the same.
Sarah, thank you very, very much. One last question, which is, what can you commit to doing as a leader to spread the commitments that are in this report to the rest of the aid community in South Sudan? Let's see whether that question has.
So again, I'm not hearing the question, but I know that it's most likely, I think I heard accountability and commitment. So I'm going to speak to what I think you said. The 9 commitments of people affected by crisis, the 9 commitments to people affected to crisis or by crisis, all 9 of them, especially commitment 5, welcoming and addressing complaints, and commitment 7, improving as we learn. Those are key. We have to hear and we have to learn and we have to improve. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah, for joining us from South Sudan and bearing with us during those technical problems that we've had, unsurprisingly. So we've heard there is still much work to do, but we are seeing some progress and evidence of change. Organizations that have gone through the CHS Alliance verification process have increased their accountability scores in some areas. And we're now joined by Aisha Ali, Executive Director of iProfile, a grassroots NGO on education and economic opportunities for refugees in Uganda. And Aisha is a vocal advocate for refugee communities with international organizations. She's advocated for refugees with the International Trade Center, which is based here in Geneva, as well as with the Danish Refugee Council. And I am delighted to have with us the Secretary General of the Danish Refugee Council, Charlotte Slenter. So welcome to both of you. Charlotte, to start off with you, you have undergone this Alliance's verification process on quality and accountability. Very briefly, because of course it was a 4-year process, how has this experience been for you?
Thank you very much, Claire. We have maintained the certification under CHS since 2017. So we've actually been examined by external auditors every year against our CHS commitments. And we see it in the following way, that these external auditors actually help us as they bring a very fresh perspective, but they also bring a critical eye on where we are and how good we are at actually complying with our 9 commitments here. So through that process, we have actually continuously been able to learn and receive valuable independent assessment of our level of compliance with CHS commitments. And we have been then granted specific timeframes to demonstrate progress and improvements in areas where we needed progress and improvements. So that's been very helpful for us to be able to work more systematically to address the areas of non-conformity on an annual basis. So what we do internally is actually to establish global and regional action plans and progress reports, so that we can see how we are progressing up against the commitments and the areas where we have not conformed totally with the CHS commitments. And that's been a very useful process.
So Charlotte, I was going to say, I mean, how accountable do you think you now are to the communities that you serve?
I mean, what we see out of these evaluations is that we actually have quite a high level of performance in the application of the commitments in general. So we have demonstrated that our responses are appropriate, they are relevant, they are coordinated, they are complementary. But there are a number of improvements that we still have to make. And especially within 2 areas of commitment, which is commitment 4, which is based on responses that are based on communication, participation, and feedback, and the commitment 5, which has got to do with whether the complaints are welcome and addressed. And these are areas where GRC, but also many other organizations, have seen areas of weakness in the process since 2017. So these are areas that we are working on continuously.
Thank you. Well, yes, I think perhaps human nature, no organization necessarily wants to have complaints, but it does need to welcome them, to be accountable. And let me just bring in Aisha into the conversation to ask you whether you've seen any changes in the way organizations are addressing and welcoming complaints, and also listening and really making sure that the voice of these communities are heard and that they can participate.
Thank you very much, Claire. I'm really excited to join in on this timely conversation. Yes, I have seen a couple of changes, especially on complaints committees being set up. Before, it wasn't something that was given priority. Now you see that there's a bit of fast response, especially when the complaints come through. And then staff members have actually also been assigned to deal with complaints and have full authority. Like Charlotte mentioned earlier, oftentimes, especially on commitment 5, we've seen a bit of delay on complaints, but now organizations are looking at building the capacity of the staff members to have full authority to kind of start responding to these complaints timely. Also, communities have been updated on the progress of solving these complaints and steps being taken to prevent future occurrences. That way, you find that before, once the complaints are sent through, a lot of people are kept, not aware of what's happening, but now having to actually call them and talk to them and have these conversations, candid conversations on what the complaints are to avoid future occurrences, especially on co-creation, is very changes I have seen. But also in terms of voicing, we've seen communication is now heavily reliant on refugee community leaders, and they are the first point of contact for clarity. Before then, would assume, as we have strategies, would assume solutions to these problems, but having community leaders at the front line and having them respond to some of these issues has proven to be an approach that is going to give us long-term accountability in aid and interventions having great impact.
Charlotte, I can see you nodding along there when Aisha was talking about the importance of having community leaders involved in this so that there is more participation and accountability. Is that a strategy that the Danish Refugee Council puts into practice?
It is indeed, and I think, community feedback mechanisms are extremely important here as a mechanism actually to receive the right input from the communities, from our people of concern, to be able to actually take on board their recommendations as to how best to deliver and what to deliver to the people of concern. So, this is an area where we have also been developing a global sort of community feedback mechanism and guidance and toolkits to actually improve the feedback mechanisms we have in place in our many different country operations across the globe to actually better be able to catch that feedback from the people of concern. And this toolkit, allows you to, or allows us to assist our country operations from everything to setting up a new sort of feedback mechanism from the communities to help correct the feedback mechanisms that our country operations already have in place. And I believe it's very, very important, but it's also a very complex area because we sometimes see that our feedback mechanisms are not used to the extent that we would like them to be utilized by the people of concern. And there we need to go in and actually assess why is it that we don't receive the feedback that we are actually asking for. And there are a number of factors. Sometimes it's lack of access to the helplines, to the information, and all of that. But sometimes it's also lack of confidence in these systems. So you actually have to work on building that confidence with the communities that you serve. And that's all sometimes an endeavor that takes some time, but it's also an endeavor that actually needs or makes it important for us to look at the mechanisms we have in place. We have an example, for instance, from Colombia, where we had set in place in a service where we were receiving and offering protection services to the refugees out of Venezuela in a Colombian protection center. Seeing that, I mean, all complaints mechanisms, feedback mechanisms were in place, but they were not being utilized. And then we actually asked the people of concern, why is that? Why don't you use our systems here? And they said, I mean, we would not rather prefer individual and more sort of qualitative interviews to provide that feedback, rather than helplines and hotlines to sort of communicate feedback in mails, etc. So by then introducing another modality of that community feedback mechanism, we actually managed to increase dramatically the feedback that we got from communities to the services that they needed and the services we were rendering. So it's also looking at these feedback mechanisms and how you can make them work well in the setting you are in. And it's obviously often both very socially and very culturally sensitive how these mechanisms work and what you should put in place in different cultural and social contexts.
Yeah, absolutely. Aisha, on these feedback mechanisms, they really, as Charlotte says, got to be culturally specific. And there in Colombia, they didn't want hotlines. They wanted a more individual approach, which of course, presumably takes more resources. Aisha, are you hearing anything about in your area? What sort of approach to feedback and complaints do people want?
I will allude to what Charlotte said. Definitely, a lot of people, especially because of the laxity with the helplines, the suggestion boxes, having delays for feedback, and especially with the cultural setting, you know, a lot of people want to have a deeper analysis of what their complaint is. Some of them are very sensitive. So we've seen, rather than them being virtual, a lot of people want to have them in person, and they're proving to be more definitely more efficient. So I would allude to what Charlotte said and re-echo all stakeholders to actually implore stakeholders to try and see how they can contextualize feedback mechanisms to see how they can best get more information and feedback on the scene. Yeah.
Charlotte, what I'm hearing here is, of course, people want a more individualized approach. That's only natural. But of course, the Danish Refugee Council, it's an emergency response organization. You're first having to provide the basics, food, shelter, and water. So how do you balance these two needs?
I mean, sometimes that is the complexity that we work in, and the balancing of these needs is sometimes complex. We obviously require all staff to involve displacement affected people in all phases of project design, but also project implementation to the extent possible. But I mean, due to time constraints, due to political and bureaucratic obstacles, due to lack of funding, and sort of that ethos of urgency that we bear within us as an organization, that is not always possible. Or we don't roll it out to the extent that we would like in all circumstances. So sometimes these feedback mechanisms are lagging a little bit behind sort of the urgent response that we want to give. And we also there have to look at that as we are addressing in the feedback mechanisms, that you actually also need to build an awareness among the communities you work in that there is a possibility for feedback, and that sometimes take a little bit of time. And you also need, as we talked about, to build that trust and to sort of cross these barriers. But what is important is that we have that in mind right up from the start in designing our projects. I mean, how we can set up a mechanism of the best kind to actually get that feedback, and then continuously work to become better at it. I think what is very important in the toolkit that we developed as well is that a lot of the good advice and the best practice that we have put in there is actually based on the reality that our staff work in. So, I mean, it's based on a lot of very concrete and practical input of our staff on that have developed mechanisms in the field themselves. And that is circulated now as inspiration in our own organization, but is obviously also available to other organizations that would like to get that information on how it could work for us. So it's an area that you really need to keep attention on, especially when you work in emergency settings and with emergency assistance.
You make a very good point about co-collaboration, and I'll come to Aisha in a moment on that, but I'm getting a question in from Fernanda Baumhart and Tamara Zibin, who, Charlotte, says, complaint and feedback mechanisms are no silver bullet. Are they really safe for everyone?
I mean, we make a very big effort to communicate that sort of the feedback that people provide, our staff, our people of concern, our partners, all stakeholders, that is treated with confidentiality and that it is safe for people to report. And I think that is very much the basis for the trust that we need to build with the people we request feedback from, that they should be able to rely on not being disclosed or not being disclosed as people behind that information or feedback that they are providing. I mean, we have built a code of conduct reporting mechanism in our organization that has been in place for 15 years. And what we see is that confidence is built gradually. We see an increasing number of cases being reported, and to us, it's a signal that there is gradually more confidence in that confidentiality in the reporting mechanisms, so that people can rely on, yes, you can report with confidentiality not being revealed, and yes, there will be investigation of what you report into our mechanisms. But it's not a thing that is gained from one day to another. I mean, you have to build it.
As you say, Charlotte, you have to build it, and your previous point was about the need for co-creation in the design of the feedback mechanisms, the complaint mechanisms. Aisha, a last word to you about what sort of involvement have you been involved with co-creation, and would you like to see more, perhaps not just from the Danish Refugee Council, but from other international organizations?
Definitely. Thank you very much, Claire. Co-collaboration is something that is very critical, and I'll speak to my engagements on the youth consultation with the DRC that was leading up to the Global Refugee Forum, as well as post-high-level events. And these sessions or high-level events have proven to be very instrumental for long-term aid accountability. And I say this because one, there was consultation with community leaders, right? We had a diverse group of people from East Africa, from Asia, coming together to voice out the needs of what their community is saying, what is working for them, what do they want, what's not working. And we've seen this leaning towards feeding into mechanisms for stakeholders. People are aware of feedback mechanisms, people are aware of complaint mechanisms, and is the community able to work around these mechanisms that have been designed? But most importantly, I want to applaud DRC for the efforts in involving young people right from the beginning. And I say this because, one, it boosts up the confidence of community leaders to, one, engage closely with stakeholders when it comes to implementation, but also because the peoples of concern or the refugee communities look up to their leaders. And definitely, if it's trust building, we need to have co-creation. Following up on that, I remember during the GRF, it lays a playing field for young people to actually have a seat on the table with stakeholders and engage, co-create, but also equally hold each other accountable. I'd call it reciprocal accountability, where INGOs are sharing their pledges, but also young people are actually sharing their pledges and giving recommendations. And I'm proud to say that from the first consultation that we had in about 2018, from the recommendations that we gave, I've seen a lot of them actually come to fruition. So yes, we are taking a step towards the right direction, but a lot more needs to be done, especially in consulting communities, but also not just having a glossy document and actually taking action on those recommendations. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Aisha. Thank you, Charlotte, for joining us for this discussion. It's good to know that the Danish Refugee Council has gone through this verification process and is improving, but exactly as Aisha says, there is more work to be done. So thank you very much, both of you, for joining us. So we're seeing progress, but do we need systemic change? And how can we use the Humanitarian Accountability Report to affect that level of change? Well, I'm delighted to be joined by 3 leaders who are in a position to bring about change within their organizations and beyond. So let me introduce to you Mette Tigersen, Humanitarian Director of Danida, Denmark's International Cooperation Agency. Kati Sattler, HR Director at the UN Refugee Agency, and Marvin Parvez, Regional Director, Community World Service in Asia, a development and advocacy agency that's a member of the CHS Alliance. So I'm going to ask each of you a very simple question, and I'm sure there's a 1 or 2 sentence answer that you're going to give me. Let me start with Mette. Is accountability non-negotiable?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it is. That is also the reason why we actually do require all our strategic partners, and that is the 18 largest Danish NGOs that receive funding from the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that we require them to undertake independent verification or certification against the core humanitarian standards, because for us as a donor, accountability is non-negotiable.
Thank you very much. Kati, your answer.
No, thanks, Claire. I completely agree. It has to be non-negotiable, of course, you know, and aligning with the IASC principles statement. Our responsibility to people affected is why we do what we do. It's part of what we do. I would argue that it's not just about standards, it's also about human behavior. Those colleagues who are out there making the difference, actually living that accountability day to day. But perhaps I'm a bit people focused because I am the HR director at UNHCR, so that.
And indeed, Obanda, you will remember at the beginning, said, well, international organizations are very good on policies, but they need to do more on people. So we'll come back to that point, certainly, Kati. Marvin, your thoughts on accountability being non-negotiable?
Good evening, Claire. Thank you for this opportunity. There's a saying in my language that a melon kind of picks up and adopts from melons around it. And if you look in the last 2 decades, we've seen wars in the name of human rights, wars for democracy, wars to eliminate mass weapons of destruction, things like that. And we saw millions suffered and there was no accountability. In my neighborhood where I live, there was a war on terror for 2 decades. With trillions of dollars later, I see very little accountability. I, as somebody in this South Asian part of region, I'm quite concerned with the large number of neo-Nazi parties gaining presence in parliaments across Europe, the Trumpism in the USA, and I can say the same for many parts of Asia and Africa and Latin America. So the accountability is much more needed today than ever before. It's absolutely not negotiable. But are we, as the sector, willing to, you know, bite the hand that feeds us? I will stop at that question. Thank you.
When you say bite the hands that feeds you, are you talking about the donors, Marvin? And what would you like to see the donors do differently?
Well, how much time do I have?
I would say a minute or 2, because otherwise it's difficult for people to carry on focusing on these answers.
No, definitely. I definitely am questioning the donor countries. And I would later talk about how accountability, again, in my experience, should be a community-led process, not a donor-driven process. So I do see funding countries as part of the problem and not the solution. Thank you.
So just give us a specific, and then of course I'll hand back to Meta. What is it that you're seeing the donor countries do that you think doesn't help local communities?
Well, like I said, in some of the other questions I was going to answer, but yeah, like I said, I gave you examples of unjust wars in the Middle East, in the country I work in, and the region I belong to, and how there was no accountability. When I was giving that Mellon story, we see non-accountable government and leadership globally, and that affects us. I think that affects every sector around the globe, and I think that affects us to be less accountable. So it would be starting.
That's obviously a big geopolitical issue, which I'm not sure whether on the panel today we can necessarily address. I'm just wondering, Marvin, there's always the issue, and we've heard it from Charlotte Slenter from the Danish Refugee Council, about financing for accountability, financing for feedback and complaint mechanisms. Is that something, Marvin, that you would like to see to be more of a priority from the funders?
Absolutely clear. I think also in this session, it was almost implied, and during the discussion, that saving lives come first and maybe quality and accountability is second. No, quality and accountability starts from day one also. It helps us to reach out to the most vulnerable communities, maybe the ones who need accountability, aid, and support from day one. I do have another comment on that previous discussion. The safe complaint mechanism system. I think in some parts of the world, there has to be much more discussion where it would be very, very difficult for people who have complaints to come forward, because it's just not them and their lives, but lives of their family get threatened. And it's extremely vulnerable group. So I think that needs to be strengthened. When it comes to, I mean, again, in my experience, when it comes to disasters in Asia that I have worked in, you ask for a safeguarding officer, you ask for a quality and accountability officer, you ask for internal auditors. They come on the bottom of priority for donors. Whereas there's a lot of talk and very little money and financing for quality and accountability transparency. Thank you.
Thank you, Marvin. Meta there, that last point there about little financing for mechanisms, complaint mechanisms, and of course safeguarding, which is really at top of mind, especially with the low scores on preventing sexual abuse and harassment. Your response to what Marvin has been saying about that?
No, thank you so much. I think, first of all, I think I would like to agree with Marvin on one point, and that is that accountability has to be a community-led process. It's not a process that can be led by donors. I think that's very well put, and really what we should do together and make sure that this is the approach we take. I have to say on the second comment on the financing for feedback mechanisms, I think Marvin wasn't talking to me really. I think it's well known that in Denmark we have been amongst the very first founders and financiers of the core humanitarian standards. We are engaged in all the different processes in this area, and we do allow, I mean, not only do we require, as I said in my introduction, our strategic partners to be verified, the CHS verified. We also do allow for funding of local actors to also have administrative cost and to fund both accountability and feedback mechanisms. So I think the point is well taken, but I think Marvin, perhaps you weren't talking to me.
talking to the donor community more broadly, perhaps. Catty, let me bring you in. Let's look at safeguarding. And we already had that question that came in from the audience to Charlotte about these complaint and feedback mechanisms. Are they really safe for everyone? And as Marvin was saying, that some people do not feel safe because of the environment that they're in to complain or even to use the feedback mechanisms. Catty, is that a concern? And what do you do at the UN Refugee Agency to reassure communities?
Well, thanks, Claire. I mean, it's another one of those questions that could take quite a while to respond to. And let me start off by saying it's incredibly important that people who depend on us are feeling that they can trust us, trust every single one of our workforce, right? That's really, really critical. We've done a lot, I have to say. We're fortunate to have leadership in UNHCR that sees the importance of safeguarding, sees the importance of not just limiting our efforts to one area, but really taking a holistic approach. Not only do we have a senior advisor at director level who works across the span, both on sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual harassment, because we see the synergies. So it's a case of the inside reflecting the external mandate. We think that is really critical to how we work. And her work and her team has been really, really critical to do a lot on the prevention side. Now, what I believe is the critical piece is you build trust by how people go through this experience. And unfortunately, it seems like in human terms, this is very hard to eradicate as a behavior because of a lot of reasons, right? But if it happens, then you build trust by making sure that those who go through this process can do so in a way that should somebody else hear about this, that their experience was as good as possible. And I think that's something that I'm really proud. We introduced in 2020 our victim-centered approach for victims of both sexual harassment, sexual exploitation and abuse. And that's been really powerful. It's been a very accompanied journey. We have a victim care officer, our fantastic Suhura, who really works on an individual basis. Fortunately, it's not massive amounts of cases, so it allows a fairly high touch engagement. But I would lie if I say it's smooth and easy, right? We're dealing with a lot of fear. We're dealing with anxiety, trauma, and all of these aspects that go into it. So there's a lot you can do. But the other part that I find challenging is organizations like ours aren't used to having policies that actually are victim-centered at the outset. So it has forced us to rethink a lot of our processes and procedures for how we deal with things, and thinking more holistically, working internally from everywhere, from investigations over to my own division dealing with the humans who may be responsible for this. So it's forced us to think differently. The other part that I think has helped is really that we have a zero tolerance, and we really do take very, very explicit and ultimate action in these cases. It still takes too long, unfortunately, for a lot of reasons. You're trying to balance both the interest of the victims and of course, the rights of those alleged offenders. And so you've got to get there. But I feel like we're still not moving fast enough because, of course, building that trust of the communities is about taking action so that they actually know that it is safe to report. I think we made a lot of progress, but I don't think progress is ever enough in this area, unfortunately. So it's work that we continue. But again, I think key things like leadership, tangible action, rethinking how we do this as an organization, and perhaps another part that I think is critical, by having a senior advisor for this. A lot of her work is really transversal across the organization, also in the system, sharing some of the great practices that we're doing and some of the good work. So I think this is certainly helping. And, we continue to champion, even when we're not officially the IAS champions, we continue to work with those who've come after us. So more work to do for sure. But I believe action speaks louder than policies and words.
Yes, indeed. And Marvin, what sort of actions are you seeing on the ground in terms of preventing sexual abuse, exploitation and harassment? Are those policies filtering down into the ground, into actions?
I think, yes, most of the cases, situations. And when I talked about safety around it, it's a mutual concern and challenge for all of us sitting here. And let me just be more specific. Uh, in one of the countries I work in, a sexual harassment victim, it will be very, very difficult for her or him to come out and make a complaint. The person who is responsible will find out. And it's extremely insecure environment. Also in the same country, recently, an organization on issues around corruption fired some people going through the whole process. And those 5 people were picked up by the regime, and they were in a lockup and prison for the next 1 week and tortured. So this is where I'm talking about safety. It's not about confidentiality and trust. It's about the context and environment also. And neither I'm think it's a challenge for Meta. It's a challenge for Kathy and you and everybody else. How do we share experiences like this, and how can we come up with strategy to mitigate? And so our management, complaint management, is efficient, effective, and 100% safe. It cannot be 99%. It has to be 100%. Thank you.
Thank you, Marvin. And I'd like to encourage our audience, please do put questions in the chat on anything that you've heard from Kathy, Meta and Marvin. And Meta, yes, you'd like to come into the conversation.
No, thank you. Yeah, no, I just, of course, I think Marvin has a very good point on the complaint management. And of course, this is not only about the sexual harassment. I think definitely also about the corruption issues. And really, we need the feedback like this in order to make the system work better. And just if we look at the overall picture, I think there is progress, and I think it's important to also stay well informed or be very alert to the issue that there is progress. We can see that the CHS is actually a very useful instrument in driving change. It may not be a revolution, but it's definitely pushing for incremental change. And I think it was very clear in the presentation this morning that the CHA certification process is definitely pushing us in the right direction. But having said that, there is absolutely no clear that any case of sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment by aid workers is the most brutal failure of accountability at all that we see. Every single case is a failure, and every complaint that is made that we do not react on is a joint failure by us as a system. I think it's completely unacceptable, and we have to stop it. And I think that organizations are really progressing. Charlotte Slende was just highlighting some of the work done by the Danish Refugee Council. I have worked with them also in South Sudan that we discussed in the beginning. And I think on this, even as we all are very aware of the huge challenges related to the very unequal power relations that we see, it is about building trust. It is about reacting to the complaints that we see. And then incrementally, we will be pushing for change. But if we move beyond that and look at the different challenges that we have also in the report, I think we also have to be mindful that some of the opportunities, no, some of the shortcomings that your report is highlighting are really also opportunities for us to improve. I think we discussed already on the local and national leadership, but also on the environmental issues or the negative effects that we need to avoid when we implement aid. And perhaps just also to point out that sometimes the shortcomings are also opportunities, and we need to push more to improve on this. Again, maybe not incremental, not revolutions, but incremental change that sometimes provide important opportunities and sometimes in combination, because the inclusive localization agenda, I think, is pivotal in this connection, and this could also be a way for us to minimize the negative impact of our operations also on the climate issue. So perhaps we can get back to that, but just to point out that sometimes these shortcomings are also huge opportunities for change.
Yes, and as leaders, you of course are in a position to drive change, systemic change. Let's hear then from Mette, Kati and Marvin, what sort of change. Let's first start looking at within your organization. As leader, what change can you drive through? And then later we'll look at the aid sector. Please keep your questions coming in, dear audience members. So Mette, as a leader, what change can you affect? What can you do within your remit?
Well, first of all, I think the fact is that we never have enough resources to help all the people we need, and we need really to prioritize over and over again, and this is always such a challenge. And I noticed that very recently ALNAP also launched a new report on I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but it's this the State of the Humanitarian System report, and there the report found that that aid recipients that have been consulted before receiving the assistance, they are 150% more likely to feel that they receive the right aid and enough aid, as compared to those who said that they weren't consulted. So I think it's for the very obvious sake of efficiency and making aid benefit more people, we need to listen and to consult and to engage the people we want to help. So this is about using the feedback mechanisms we have and to push organizations to work in this area, and for us as donors to really be serious about better and more meaningful engagement of local and national organizations. Now we were talking about the harassment issues. So really it is also about pushing for more cooperation with national women-led organizations in our humanitarian response. I think Marvin also said this, but localization is much more than funding. And you said, Claire, I think that accountability is more than an activity, it is an approach. So it is about creating more ownership and leadership and accountability. And I think it is for us as donors to push for this change. We have in Denmark taken over the role as co-convener on the work stream, the Grand Bargain work stream on localization, and we will definitely push for this, that it's not only about the localization, but the inclusive localization agenda, and we have to commit to do better in the humanitarian sector here.
Kati, as a leader, HR director, what can you do as a leader to drive forward some systemic changes?
Oh, thanks, Claire. And it's just great to hear what Mette is saying as well. I mean, perhaps just before I go into the HR piece of things, which I think is essential, I think it's important that we continue organizationally to recognize and to remember the purpose while we're there. That might sound a bit fluffy at times, but it's actually really will guide us when we get competing requests, or we follow the donors too much, or we are too busy. Because if we remember why we were actually constituted, in our case, some 70 years ago, that will help us be a bit more pure purpose. And I think sometimes too many competing demands make them more difficult. And the most effective way to do that is listen to the people we serve. In for instance, just one concrete example of how we're trying to be more accountable is our new Refugee Advisory Board. It was amazing to see the amount of applications that came in, over 300, saying, we want to be part of these conversations. We want to help shape this organization for the future. And I think that's just one example of how we're trying to be a more responsive organization. Now, flipping it further inwards, in my role, it happens, UNHCR has nothing except for its people, right? We don't sell things. We don't even have the food or things like this. It's really all about the people and those connections that get made. And at an individual level, we're over 20,000 colleagues, but those individual connections is what builds the trust. So if we are failing in ensuring that every single one of our colleagues lives up to the standards that are expected of them any day of the week, we're all human, but at the end of the day, there are some very clear guidelines on what you're meant to do and what you're not meant to do. And if we're failing there, then we are failing on, on a global scale. I think it's fortunate that the amount of such instances is reducing with awareness. But I think the vigilance is going to be critical, and really recognizing that managing your teams, role modeling these behaviors, and being really clear that this is the way we work around here. They say that, culture can be a lot of different things, but it's really essentially how we work in this organization, how we work in this office. So if we're not role modeling the right behaviors and being very explicit on rewarding the right behaviors, but also taking consequences when it's not working, we're not fostering that type of behaviors. And I think that has to be very concrete and tangible, like I mentioned earlier on SEA, SH, but it also has to be very clear, clearly rewarded. Those managers who are managing their people well, how do you recognize that and how do you reward it? As humanitarians, we're often so busy working for the people we serve, we think that managing our teams and our people is something extra that we do on the side, and it's not. It's intrinsic to how we manage and deliver the work we do. So I think there's a lot of connections between the delivery of our mandate, the people who do so, and the culture that we co-create within the organization.
And Kati, do you think that those sort of criteria, perhaps on preventing sexual exploitation, abuse and harassment, should actually appear in people's performance reviews?
Yes and no, because I believe, depending on, that's another pet peeve of mine, performance reviews often in the world, I haven't found, I should say this, I've been doing this for many years, I haven't found a perfect one anywhere in the world. So the problem with many is that they take place after the fact. They review whether or not you did something right or wrong. But in this kind of work, that's too late. What I think is more important is that on the day you join, you sign a very nice, beautiful declaration. The second day, you might be doing your online learning activity to know what are the code of conduct, how do we do things around here, as I mentioned earlier. And then you have a conversation with your supervisor and your team. Now, how does that actually play out in our work? It's been super interesting to see. I was just in Ukraine a couple of months ago. They were setting up a very different type of operation to respond to a very, very emerging situation. One of the first things we put in place were PSCA advices and prevention of this. Why is that? Because we have a large amount of newcomers to UNHCR coming into this operation because it's so big. And we want to set the tone right from the top and from the start that this is how we do things around here. So I think those conversations are probably more effective in driving behaviors because there's a level of accountability within a team. If you've had an explicit conversation around what's okay and what's not okay, that type of personal interaction, I believe, based on my experience, weighs heavier than somebody sitting in headquarters to say to you, well, you didn't live up to this and that, although that does also have a huge impact. But I believe that individual level, and there we want to do more on making that really a part of the standard and the conversations that need to take place. So I think that's my hope is that's more effective. But if somebody is ready to reinvent performance management completely, sign me up for it. We've tried, but I'm not sure we're ever going to be successful.
But point well made. It's about the culture and it's about leaders being role models. Marvin, from where you're sitting as a leader, how can you drive forward some sort of systemic change within your organization?
Claire, thank you. The organization I work for and the alliances that we are part of there has been progress. I would echo what Mette said. Maybe we do need a revolution, especially when we say almost everybody says there's zero tolerance for sexism, corruption, and racism, and I see that changing the attitudes and culture has so many roadblocks, and I also find it that maybe our DNA has been reorganized in a way where we are actually, and I'm talking as an NGO, we on a daily basis compete with each other for every dollar and penny that's out there. So collaboration, coordination, cooperation is kind of on the back burner, if I want to say that. And similarly,
I was going to say, what can be done? Because yes, there are tensions, as we know, in the aid sector, which does compete with each other, exactly as you said. So what can be done to overcome those?
Well, actually, the report says what really hit me was it says there's some fundamental changes in overall, and I think this addresses this also. Shift in power, it talks about shift in roles, change in the business model that we have, decision-making structures, remove inequalities between international and local actors, and I'm adding this last bit, bringing the communities in the center of all this, in the middle, and not on the. And I think that is not just making fundamental changes, it's actually turning our sector upside down. And I don't know if there is total commitment. There are definitely very good examples. There are good, with all these challenges and problems, there is still billions of dollars of aid is being delivered. Lives are being saved in a very transparent, accountable, respectful, and empowering manner. But at the same time, what the report says is to turn our sector upside down. So
Marvin, that's
non-negotiable.
Really... Absolutely.
It's not an optional thing.
That's a really good point.
Sorry.
I'm aware of time, and we're getting lots of comments in from the audience, but not so many questions. So let me take that question and ask Kati and Meta to finish. Kati, do we need to turn the aid sector upside down? Marvin there talking about power imbalances, between perhaps headquarters, the field. Do we need to turn the aid sector upside down, Kati? And then I'll ask the question to Meta.
That question is not as easy as is accountability non-negotiable. You know what? I think that the entire sector should want to flip itself over a couple of times on a regular basis. I think change is something that we all need. And we often used to look, just a couple of years ago, you did a change, it was a big reorganization or something, and then you were done. But as it turns out, the world is so incredibly dynamic. There are a couple of things that I think we've all collectively learned in the past couple of years. It's too much for anyone to do alone, and that includes organizations. We need to work more together, more effectively. That's why gatherings like this and then the CHS Alliance is great, because it makes it tangible and really gives us markers to work towards. And I do believe that we need to strive for recognizing when it's time to flip ourselves over, completely rechange perhaps, but also recognize what Meta said earlier, the incremental changes, because the players in this sector are not always known for being the small, nimble, fast changers, right? It's often dominated by the larger voices, and I think that's something that we need to find a good balance. When the speedboats move fast, if you compare my organization to perhaps a bigger tanker or cruise ship, they're great and nimble and they can bring us along. But once we move on the bigger organizations, that's also extremely powerful. So I think we need to do more on this. And I think we need to be more embracing of change, and maybe we need some generational changes as well, that come back to why are we here? Why is it we do what we do? And that again comes back to shifting from where I think personally one of the challenges for the entire humanitarian sector has been, for many years, we were driven more by a compliance mindset, ticking the boxes, filling the forms. Our donors have not always helped us. They've sometimes stepped in our ways of action, because if you're so busy filling out forms and being compliant, that tends to inhibit action, and it tends to leave you very little time to actually spend on human-to-human interaction, be that with your teams or be that with the people we're there to serve. So I think finding ways collectively to work more together, because we have more common challenges than we have things that set us apart. And this is a great forum to be continuing that dialogue, I believe.
And Kati, I will go to Mette very briefly. I'll give you the last word, Mette, about whether we need massive change, revolution, as Marvin says, or incremental change. The floor is yours for about 30 seconds or a minute, and then we're going to conclude and ask our audience to engage with us one more time.
No, thank you so much for that opportunity. And can I just say how reassuring it is to listening both to Kati and to Marvin on this, because I do think we are ready for change in the humanitarian community in broad terms. It is about shifting the power, as Marvin says, and it is about putting communities at the center of our response. I think it will improve the system massively, that we will allow for greater accountability and inclusiveness, but I also think it will allow for a more coherent response to humanitarian crisis. It will allow us to work in the longer term in the nexus between humanitarian development and peace operations, and also to include climate efforts. So in that way, yes, we are ready for change. It is about the accountability and shifting the power, but it's also about working more coordinated in the broader nexus and creating a more coherent response.
Mette, Kati and Marvin, thank you very much for joining us, which was really just a snapshot of a conversation that indeed you could need a whole conference about on systemic change. Let me ask our audience, we are going to ask you on a Slido poll that you will find next to the chat, that you can put words in, and you will see that the question is, what needs to change for accountability to become non-negotiable? You've been hearing some ideas from our experts. You are a very informed audience. Some of you are most probably from the non-governmental organization community, some from the international community, some from donors. So what do you think needs to change for accountability to become non-negotiable? Please start putting your words in now in the poll that you will find next to the chat on your screen. So I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to do that. And we should be able to see the word get bigger and bigger, which I always think is a nice way of concluding a session. We've, you can all read, you don't necessarily need me to read the words for you, but I only do it because if I stop talking, you might think that I've lost connection here in Geneva. So we're getting some words that I think have been recurrent over the last hour and a half. Indeed, donor financing. We've heard from Danida about the importance of verification of the organizations that they work through, and that they do go through this CHS quality and accountability. We're seeing localization. Yes, Marvin was mentioning that, and it's about the power dynamics between headquarters. Again, most probably a subject that would require a whole conference. So community-centered, absolutely. Everybody is talking about putting the communities at the heart. And of course, as we hear, it has to be more than just a talk. There has to be actions. And in the CHS report this year, there are many, many actions. So do share that accountability manifesto that Tanya Wood, Executive Director of the CHS Alliance, was mentioning at the beginning. But this brings us to the end of this session. So back to Faye Ikong, who's your Master of Ceremonies for this event. Faye, back to you.